I have examined many maps of this city, many maps, with the utmost care. And I have never again been able to find the Rue d'Orsay. And I'm not just talking about modern maps. I know street names change, but no. I have delved into the antiquities of this place. Now, I've personally explored every region of whatever name which could possibly answer to the street that I knew as the Rue d'Orsay. And in spite of all this, the humiliating fact remains that I cannot find the house, the street, or even the neighborhood where, during the last few months of my impoverished life as a student of metaphysics at the university, I heard the music of Erich Zann. I mean, that my memory of the period is broken. I do not wonder, because my health, both physical and mental, was under great strain during the period of my residence in the Rue d'Orsay. Great strain. But you see, that I cannot find the place again is both singular and baffling, because it was within half an hour's walk of the university, and it was distinguished by peculiarities which could hardly be forgotten by anyone who's ever been there. And I have never met another person who has seen the Rue d'Orsay. The Rue d'Orsay lay across a dark river, bordered by precipitous brick, blear-windowed warehouses and spanned by a ponderous bridge of dark stone. It was always shadowy along that river, I remember, as if the smoke of the neighbouring factories blotted out the sun. And the waters of it were odorous, with stenches which I have never smelt elsewhere, and which may, in fact, one day help me to find it again, because I'd recognise those stinks at once. Beyond the bridge were narrow cobbled streets with rails, and then came the ascent, gradual at first, and then becoming incredibly steep as the Rue d'Orsay was reached. I've never seen another street as narrow and steep as the Rue d'Orsay. It was almost a cliff, completely inaccessible to vehicles, consisting in several places of flights of steps and ending at the top in a lofty ivied wall. The paving was irregular, sometimes stone slabs, sometimes cobblestone, sometimes simply bare earth with struggling greenish-grey vegetation. The houses were tall, peaked-roofed, and incredibly old, and they leaned crazily forwards and backwards. Occasionally, an opposing pair almost met across the street like an arch. In fact, there were one or two overhead bridges from house to house across the street. They kept most of the light from the ground below. And the inhabitants of the street impressed me oddly too. I mean, at first I thought it was because they were all silent and reticent, but I later decided it was because they were so very, very old. They were old folks. I don't know how I myself ever came to live in a place like that, but well, as I've said, I wasn't myself when I moved there. I wasn't right. I've been living in many places, many poor places, always evicted for want of money, until at last I came upon the tottering house in the Rue d'Orsay, kept by the paralytic Blando. It was the third house from the top of the street, and by far the tallest of the lot. My room was on the 5th floor, the only inhabited room up there, because the house was almost empty. On the night that I arrived, I heard strange music coming from the peaked garret overhead, and the next day I asked old Blando about it. And he told me that it was an old German musician, strange fellow, he said, a mute, who signed his name Erich Zann and who played the viola da gamba in a cheap theatre orchestra. He said that it was Zann's desire to play at night when he got back from the theatre that made him choose that isolated garret room, whose single gable window, he added, was the only point on the street from which one could look out over the terminating wall at the declivity and panorama beyond. And thereafter, I heard him every night. Old Erich Zann, bowing away. And although he kept me awake, I was haunted by the weirdness of his music. I mean, knowing little of the art myself, I was nevertheless certain that none of his harmonies bore any relation to any music that I had heard before. And I concluded that he was a composer of highly original genius. Although the longer I listened, you see, the more fascinated I became, until after about a week I resolved that I would make the old man's acquaintance. So one night I intercepted Zann in the hallway as he was returning from work, and I told him that I'd like to get to know him and to be with him when he played. He was a small, lean, bent old fellow with shabby clothes, surprisingly bright blue eyes, a grotesque satyr-like face, and a nearly bald head. Now, at my first words, he seemed annoyed, even slightly frightened. But, well, my obvious friendliness soon melted him, and he grudgingly motioned me to follow him up the dark, creaking, rickety staircase. When we got to his room, the first thing that struck me was how big it was, seeming all the great, I suspect, because of its extraordinary barrenness and neglect. I mean, of furniture, there was only a narrow iron bedstead, a dingy washstand and a small table, 3 old-fashioned chairs. There was a music stand, and piles of sheet music were strewn about the floor, but the abundance of dust and cobwebs made the place seem more deserted than inhabited. I mean, evidently, Erich Zann's world of beauty lay in some far distant cosmos of the imagination. Then, motioning me to sit down, he closed the door, turned the large wooden bolt, and lighted a candle to augment the one that he brought with him. And then he removed his instrument from its moth-eaten covering, seated himself in the least uncomfortable of the chairs, and offering no choice, and playing from memory, he didn't use the music stand, he enchanted me for over an hour with strains the likes of which I'd never heard before, strains which must have been of his own devising. Well, yeah, to describe the exact nature of this music is impossible for one unversed in the art as I, but the tunes are a kind of fugue, I think you'd probably say, with recurrent passages of the most captivating quality. But you see, to me, they were most notable for the absence of any of the weirder notes that I'd overheard in my room on previous nights, those haunting notes that I'd remembered and had often tried humming and whistling unsuccessfully to myself. So when the old man at length laid down his bow, I asked him if he would render some of them for me as a kind of encore. But even as I began my request, that wrinkled satyr-like face lost the bored placidity it had worn during the playing, and it seemed to take on the same curious mixture of anger and fright which I noticed when I first accosted him. I mean, for a moment, I was inclined to use persuasion regarding rather likely the whims of senility. I even tried to awaken my host's weirder mood by whistling a few of the strains which I'd remembered from the night before. I did not, however, pursue this course for more than a moment, because when the dumb musician recognized the whistled air, his face distorted into an expression quite beyond analysis, and his long, cold, bony right hand shot up to stop my mouth. Now, as he did this, he compounded his eccentricity by casting a startled glance towards the curtained window of the room, as if fearful of some intruder. I mean, a glance doubly absurd considering how high the garret stood above the adjacent rooftops. As the concierge had told me, this window was the only point on the whole street from which one could look over the wall at the summit. Now, in fact, the old man's glance brought Blando's remark back to my mind, and with a certain capriciousness, I suppose, I felt moved to look out myself over the panorama of moonlit roofs and city lights beyond the hilltop. I moved towards the window, and I was about to draw the shabby curtains aside when, with a rage even greater than before, Erich Zann was on top of me again, motioning wildly now with his head towards the door and pathetically trying to drag me away from the window with his hands. I was rather taken aback, and I'm sorry to say that an undignified but thankfully brief struggle ensued, which only really came to an end when I fairly shrieked at the old fellow that I was perfectly happy to leave his room if he'd only take his hands off me. Well, his clutch relaxed, and as he saw my disgust and offence, his own anger seemed to subside too, still holding on to me, but much more gently now. He guided me into a chair, and then he crossed to the little table, sat down, and began writing quickly with a pencil. The note which he eventually handed me was an appeal for tolerance and forgiveness. He was an old and lonely man, he said, and was afflicted with strange fears and nervous disorders connected with his music and with other things. He'd enjoyed my listening to his playing, he said, and he wished that I'd come again and not mind his eccentricities, but he couldn't play to another his weird harmonies, and he couldn't bear hearing them from another, nor could he bear having anything in his room touched by another. He'd not known until our hallway conversation that I could overhear his playing, and he now asked if I would arrange with Blando to take a lower room where I could not hear him at night. He would, he said, defray the difference in rent himself. Well, as I sat there deciphering the execrable French, I must say I began to feel more lenient towards the old fellow. I mean, he was evidently a victim, as I was myself back then, of physical and nervous suffering. And, well, my metaphysical studies had taught me kindness. In the silence, as I read, there came a slight sound from the window. The shutter must have rattled in the night wind, I suppose. In any case, both Erich Zann and I started rather violently at it. Well, when I'd finished reading his letter, I nodded, shook my host by the hand, and departed as a friend. The next day, Blando gave me a more expensive room on the third floor between the apartments of an aged moneylender and the room of a taxidermist. There was no one on the fourth floor. Well, it was not long before I discovered that Erich Zann's eagerness for my company was not as great as it had seemed when he was persuading me to move down from the fifth floor. He never did ask me to call on him, and when I took it upon myself to knock on his door, he appeared uneasy and he played listlessly. And this was always at night, by the way. He slept in the daytime and would admit no one. And I suppose I must admit that my liking for him didn't exactly grow either, although his weird music still held an odd fascination, as did that attic room of his. I had a very strong desire, a rather strange one, I suppose, to look out of that solitary window over the wall and the unseen slope at the city which must lie outspread there. Once I went up to the garret during theatre hours while Zann was out, but the door was locked. What I did succeed in doing, again, however, was to overhear his nocturnal recitals. At first, I tiptoe up to my old fifth floor, but then I grew bold enough to climb the last creak staircase to the garret itself. And there, on that narrow landing, outside the bolted door with the covered keyhole, I would often hear sounds which filled me with an indefinable dread. The dread of vague wonder and brooding mystery. It wasn't that the sounds were hideous, they weren't, but you see, they held vibrations suggestive of nothing on this globe of earth. And at certain intervals, that they assumed a symphonic quality, which I could hardly conceive as produced by a single player. I mean, it was evident that Erich Zann was a genius of wild power. As the weeks passed, the playing grew wilder still, and the dumb old musician acquired a furtiveness, a haggardness that was pitiful to behold. He refused now to admit me at any time, and he shunned me whenever we met on the stairs. And then one night, as I listened outside his door, I heard the shrieking viol swell into a chaotic babel of sound. It was a pandemonium which would have led me to doubt my own fragile sanity had not there come from behind that locked door piteous proof that the horror was real. You know, it was the awful, inarticulate cry which only a mute can utter, and which rises only in moments of the most terrible fear and anguish. Zann! I knocked on the door repeatedly. Zann, what's wrong? But there was no response. I waited in the dark, shivering with cold and fright, until I heard the poor old man's feeble effort to rise from the floor by the aid of a chair. Presuming that he was coming round after a fainting fit, I renewed my knocking, and I called out my name to reassure him. I heard him stumble across the room to the window and close the shutter and the sash. Then he stumbled to the door, which he falteringly unfastened to admit me. Now, this time, his delight at my presence was unfeigned. His distorted face gleamed with relief while he clutched at my coat as a child clutches at its mother's skirts. Trembling, he forced me into a chair and then slumped into one himself, beside which his viol and bow lay carelessly on the floor. And then he just sat there, nodding strangely and giving the impression of intense and fearful listening. At length he seemed to be satisfied, and crossing to the table, he scribbled a brief note which he handed to me. Then he returned to the table and he began to write rapidly. The note implored me, in the name of mercy and for the sake of my own curiosity, to remain exactly where I was while he prepared a full account in German of all the marvels and terrors which beset him. And so I waited, and the dumb man's pencil flew. It was perhaps an hour later. I was still waiting, while his feverishly written sheets continued to pile up, that I saw Zann suddenly start, as if from the hint of a terrible shock. Unmistakably now, he was looking at the curtained window, and again he seemed to be listening intently. And then I half fancied that I heard a sound myself. It wasn't a horrible sound. It was an exquisitely low and infinitely distant musical note. I mean, it might have come from a player in one of the neighbouring houses, or from some room beyond the wall over which I'd never been able to look. But its effect upon Erich Zann was terrible. He threw down his pencil, snatched up his instrument, and began to rend the night with sounds, the wildness of which I could never have imagined. I mean, this was much more horrible than anything I'd heard him play before, because now I could see the expression on his face, and I realized that the motive behind the music was the starkest terror. You know, he was simply trying to make a noise, to ward something off or to drown something out. What? I could not imagine, awesome though I felt it must be. Louder and louder, wilder and wilder, mounted the shrieking and whining of that desperate viol. And yet, you see, the music kept to the last the qualities of supreme genius, which I knew that this strange old man possessed. God, he was dripping now with perspiration, twisted like a monkey and always darting frantic glances towards the curtained window. In his frenzied strains, I could almost see shadowy satyrs and bacchanals dancing and whirling insanely through seething abysses of clouds and smoke and lightning. And now a howling night wind sprang up outside, as if in answer to the mad playing within, and began to rattle the shutters. Zann's screaming viol outdid itself, emitting sounds that I'd never thought a stringed instrument could emit. The shutter suddenly unfastened and began slamming against the window, and then the glass shattered and the chill wind rushed in, making the candles sputter and rustling the sheets of paper on the table where Zann had been writing out his terrible secret. I looked at him and I saw now he was far past conscious observation. His blue eyes were bulging, glassy and sightless, and the frantic playing had become a blind, mechanical, unrecognizable orgy that no words could ever describe. A sudden gust of wind now, stronger than the others, caught up the manuscript and bore it towards the window. I leapt up in desperation to catch the flying pieces of paper, but they were gone before I reached the shattered panes. But as I neared the window, I thought I heard a shriller, steadier note that came not from the viol, not from the wind. It was a calm, deliberate, purposeful, mocking note from far away in the west. And then I remembered my wish to gaze from this window, the only point in the Rue d'Orsay from which one might see beyond the wall. It was very dark, but the city's lights always burned, and I expected to see them shining through the rain and the wind. Yet when I looked out, while the candles sputtered and the insane viol howled with the night wind, I saw no city spread below, no friendly lights gleaming from remembered streets, but only the blackness of space illimitable, unimagined space, alive with motion and music, and having no semblance to anything on earth. And as I stood there, looking in bewilderment and terror, the wind blew out the candles in that ancient peaked garret, leaving me in a savage, impenetrable darkness, with black, relentless, empty chaos before me, and the demon madness of that night-baying viol behind. I staggered back in the dark, crashed against a table, overturned a chair, and finally groped my way to the place where the blackness screamed with music. To save Erich Zann, I could at least try, whatever powers opposed me. Once, I thought some chill thing brushed me and I screamed, but my scream could not be heard above that hideous viol. And then suddenly, out of the blackness, the madly soaring bow struck me, and I knew that I was close to the player. I reached out and I found his shoulder, which I shook to bring him to his senses, but still the viol shrieked on without slackening, so I moved my hand to his head, whose mechanical nodding I was able to stop, and I shouted in his ear that we must both flee from these unknown terrors of the night. But he neither answered me, nor abated the frenzy of his playing, while all through the garret strange currents of wind seemed to dance in the darkness. Now, when my hand touched his ear, I had shuddered. I knew not why. I knew not why until I felt his face. That ice cold, stiff, unbreathing face, whose glassy eyes bulged uselessly into the void. And then, by some miracle, I found the door, worked the bolt, and plunged away from that dead, animated thing in the darkness, and from the ghoulish howling of that accursed vial whose fury increased even as I plunged, leaping down those endless stairs through the dark house, racing into the steep ancient street of steps and tottering houses, clattering over cobbles to the putrid canyon-walled river beyond, panting across the dark bridge to the broader, healthier streets and boulevards that I knew. These are the terrible impressions that still linger with me. And I recall that there was no wind and the moon was out, and that all the lights of the city twinkled. And despite my most careful searches and investigations, I've never since been able to find the Rue d'Orsay. And in fact, I'm not wholly sorry, either for that or for the loss into undreamable abysses of those closely written sheets, which alone could have explained the music of Erich Zann.